Yellow and Red Mix by Digits 27, Chapter 21. By the time Naruto had made it into the arena floor, the crowd had died down into a dissatisfied but dull roar. He could tell that there were still many people irritated by Sasuke's loss. He briefly wondered what that might mean for the last Uchiha, but he put it out of his mind. Instead, he sized up his opponent across from him. He reminded Naruto so much of Gaara. It was the way he stood, stoic and silent, yet definitely confident in his abilities. Naruto felt he had every reason to be. The Aburama clan's specialty was certainly impressive, if just slightly weird. He wondered how they were actually able to carry chakra eating bugs inside their own bodies without dying. He was pondering whether or not it was some kind of summoning contract, and the implications of that when Hayate finally began the match. Luckily, the majority of Naruto's strategy for this match was staying strategically away, so he didn't need to move. Shino was like Gaara in the combat as well, staying still while his bugs took care of all the actual fighting. Naruto saw those same bugs quickly emerge from Shino, no doubt expecting Naruto to immediately rush into combat. He supposed he could have done that, but it would have defeated the purpose of his next item on the tuning checklist, patience. Naruto merely observed as the entire swarm of the little chakra suckers poured out of the unmoving boy. He was quickly surrounded on all sides in a small oasis of land that wasn't covered by the Kikaichu, neither combatant having made a single move yet. You were foolish to allow yourself to be surrounded like that. The Kikaichu will slowly drain your body of chakra until there is nothing left to take. You should forfeit now. Save yourself the pain. Naruto just nodded with a smile on his face, taking the stoic Aburama by surprise, slightly as the bug user wondered what he was planning. Thanks for the warning. I just wanted to test your bugs, see how fast they can really drain my chakra. And honestly, Naruto was already beginning to feel the effects of the effects. Chakra was slowly being sucked from his body, seemingly through the air into the into the air itself, though much less than they could have if they were directly on him. He fought back the urge to drop down on one knee. The effects were truly exhausting, but he managed to maintain his posture and even crossed his arms a little, acting bored. The crowd was confused. After Naruto's last fight, they had at least expected some action or a good show. Instead, both boys were merely standing there. To make it even worse, Naruto appeared to be allowing himself to lose, letting his energy be siphoned off into the Kikaichu. Shino didn't show it, but he was both surprised and impressed. His bugs were working at full capacity, and Naruto was still standing. That alone was a feat in of itself, and Shino could at least commemorate him. Nobody had lasted this long before. However, that begrudging respect quickly turned into worry as the minute went by, and Naruto showed no visible sign of fatigue. He hadn't moved a muscle once, except to reposition himself, and was now lazily looking around the stadium. That worry increased tenfold when he realized that many of his Kikaichu had begun retreating to his body, unable to absorb any more chakra from Naruto. In essence, they got full from eating his chakra. To say that Shino was surprised would be one hell of an understatement. That had definitely never happened before. How are you doing this? Nobody has this much chakra. Naruto finally acknowledged the Aburame, turning to face him with a large smile. Oh good, then at least it's working. Honestly, you had me a little worried there for a while. I thought I had misjudged how much your bugs would ingest. At this point, Naruto began noticing that the ring of insects surrounding him had gotten smaller and was still decreasing as more and more flew back to their host. When about half of them were gone, Naruto began walking, slowly at first, but increasing his speed. The Kikachu moved to intercept him, but they were sluggish and weighed down by their excessive meal. He easily dodged the lazy attack and was quickly approaching a startled and unprepared Shino, who could only watch as Naruto moved closer. He couldn't form a bug clone quick enough, so he dropped into his family's taijutsu stance. He was uncertain about the outcome of this match now, as Naruto had kept up with Neji, so he would easily deal with the Aburama's less developed taijutsu. However, the bewildered was surprised when Naruto merely stopped a few feet away from him, not bothering to attack. He quickly understood why when he felt the cold steel of a kunai press up against his neck. He could only turn enough to see a smiling Naruto behind him, holding said kunai with the intent to use it if Shino moved an inch. At least tell me how. Naruto pondered the request for a moment and nodded curtly. Okay, I knew I might be facing you, so for the entire month we had to prepare, I started sealing as much of my chakra as I could into temporary seals across my body. All I did on this match was release them when I started to feel your Kikachu feed off of me. They fed on my old chakra, and I held onto my own. He smiled all the way through the explanation, and Shino had to admit it was incredibly smart, pointing out a large flaw in the Aburama's attack plan. However, he felt secure in the knowledge that Naruto was only able to pull off the feat thanks to having the appropriate knowledge beforehand. There was nobody on Earth with that much chakra to attempt to attempt this unprepared, but even so, Shino would definitely be having a discussion with his father about this later. Thank you for showing me a flaw in my strategy. Naruto nodded politely again as Shino raised his arm to signal he was forfeiting the match. Once again, the crowd seemed dissatisfied with the outcome. Nothing exciting happening at all. The Brahma clan, however, had watched riveted to the entire display. They were equally as intrigued as Shino was by Naruto's foreplaying, and even the clan head had to commend the young genin strategy. Naruto, on the other hand, was pretty pleased with himself. Shino didn't seem that bad, so it was nice that he didn't have to hurt him. He saw what Gaara meant when the stoic wielder showed his like for him. They walked out of the stadium together, Naruto towards the competitor's box now that he was guaranteed a place in the finals, and Shino towards his family in the stands. As they did so, Gaara once again entered the arena, Lee matching his Shunshin with an overexcited sprint to win. They managed to arrive at the same moment, much to many people's shock that Lee could actually beat a Shunshin just by running. If Gaara was also impressed, he certainly didn't show it. He merely began drawing out sand from the gourd, already preparing himself for the same maneuvers that defeated Sasuke. He figured that if it worked, then there was no use in trying something else. Lee was also preparing in his own way by removing his ankle weights early. He had asked Guy earlier and was given full permission. When both Genin appeared ready, Hayate jumped backwards, very far backwards if this fight would be anything like Gaara's last one. Instantly, Gaara was preparing the dome of sand. However, he wasn't expecting the sheer speed that Lee now possessed without his ankle weights. In a literal flash of movement, Lee appeared, reappearing almost instantly at Gaara's side, much to the Ichibi Jinchuriki's shock. One hard and swift kick later, Gaara found himself hurtling backwards out of the protective influence of his sand. The gourd on his back broke down just in time to cushion his otherwise painful fall. Even so, he managed to leave a small trench due to the sheer velocity the kick managed to send him. Before he could even stand up, he felt Lee's foot connect again, flicking him up in the air quite violently. It didn't stop there. Somehow, the Taijutsu prodigy managed to launch kick after bone-breaking kick at Gaara, obviously springing back off the floor each time just to reconnect with Gaara's body. It was all happening far too fast for Gaara to properly process what was happening. Once he was high enough into the air, namely level with the actual stance, Lee had wrapped him up in barrages and bandages, and they were already traveling down, spinning wildly like a miniature tornado. Front lotus! The cry came out instantaneously before both competitors drove harshly into the ground. Gaara head first, with Lee using that to cushion his own fall. Lee backed away from the crater as the crowds of people looked on in wonder and shock. Once again, there was the general moan of people who had lost a lot of money betting on Gaara. When the smoke cleared, revealing his motionless form, Lee made a gleaming smile as he looked up into the stands to once again his sensei's approval. His celebration was cut short as a massive whip of sand slammed into his undefended side, sending him hurtling back across the stadium. The cross-rotation turned to Gaara once again, standing completely unharmed back where he had started the match. Those who hadn't been focused on Lee saw him rise up out of the ground, apparently having been there the entire time. The shell of a boy that still remained in the crater slowly dissolved back into sand before rejoining the rest of it floating around Gaara. Now, Gara knew how fast Lee could travel. He wasn't going to allow the boy to get the upper hand again. He sent out tendrils after tendril at the spandex wearing boy, each one smashing into the ground with enough force to cause small tremors. He normally didn't let his emotions get the better of him in combat, but he was slightly angered that Lee's attacks may well have hurt him had it not been a sand clone taking the beating. Lee, on the other hand, now found himself dodging left, right, and center as arm-like constructs of sand filled his vision, drawing their form from the ground underneath him. He managed to dodge each one, but as they backed him into a corner, he was finding it increasingly difficult. Soon, that entire side of the stadium was covered in dust as Gara kept up his relentless assault, determined to simply bat Lee out of the stadium itself, even if that meant through the floor. Finally, he stepped, sensing no more movements behind the veil of dust and debris that was only now allowed to settle. Gara stayed where he was, wary for any signs of movements inside the smothering cloud of smoke and dust. He didn't even look tired from the exertion of moving that volume of sand. In fact, his arms were still crossed over his chest. By the time his sand had finally retreated back to his now forming to his now form, back to him, now forming a thin ring which orbiting him slowly, a dust that had settled enough to see nothing. Lee was nowhere to be seen in that side of the arena. In fact, it appeared he had vanished completely from the stadium. Gara cocked an eyebrow, curious as to where his opponent had vanished. So far, Lee had showed no attempt at using ninjutsu or genjutsu, so it made a lot of people curious as to how he had simply vanished without a trace. Their questions were answered when everybody in the stadium simultaneously heard a distinctive whistling piercing through the eerie silence. Severe! A small black dot appeared over the stadium, rocketing down at tremendous speed. Leaf! That thought quickly resolved into Lee's spandex coating form that now spotted a fair few rings along its surface. Hurricane! Lee's body impacted with the stadium in an almighty crash, powerful enough to send an enormous blast of air into the stands. The ground around the impact zone rose up for a few seconds as the loss of displacement struggled to compensate for Lee's crash. It came back down as physics righted itself, and a crater worthy of a meteorite was revealed from the dust and debris. In the center stood a panting Lee, whose skin had inexplicably turned red, and his eyes had lost their entire color. There was no sign of Gara anywhere, and Naruto worried for his friend's safety for a moment. It was premature, however, as not too long after, Gara rose from the ground, the dust and dirt having covered him to the point of invisibility. He looked suitably shocked by the attack. His eyes were wide. The reason he had survived unscathed at all revealed itself when fragments of what appeared to be his skin dropped off of his body. The sand armor fell from his body, his mind unable to hold it together as he reeled from the devastating attack. He was lucky that it took a few moments for the newly changed Lee to even realize he was still standing, enough time to right himself and begin pulling sand clones out of the ground. First 2, then 10, then 50 clones rose up at the ground. They were fed from the earth itself, even though it took a fair amount of Gara's considerable reserve to manage. By now, Lee had figured out his attack had failed and went about the newly reconfigured stadium, making short work of all Gara's clones. Each was swiftly removed from existence as he blurted about the stadium like he had no mass whatsoever. However many he destroyed, though, Gara would just create more. They didn't actually do anything, though, merely standing around just waiting to be pulverized by Lee's strong fist style. Gara used them as a distraction to retreat from Lee's unimaginable fast form and start to concentrate from what he needed to do. Anybody watching him, and a fair few people were by now considering Lee was moving too fast to be seen by the naked eye, would have seen his sand begin to drain into the earth. He closed his eyes, feeling the vibrations in the earth that Lee was making through the tiny streams of sand beneath the surface of the ground. Taking a large breath in to steady his nerves and concentration. Gara took on an extremely focused look. Imperial sand net. Before the last words was even out of his mouth, thousands of strings or sand burst out of every corner of the stadium, crossing over one another until razor-sharp lines of sand crisscrossed every meter of the arena. Lee was stopped in his tracks. He couldn't even move a muscle or risk slicing himself into pieces. Lee actually smiled when he realized the only part of his body that he could even move was his arm, so that he could forfeit. He did so quickly before Gaara decided to actually complete the lethal jutsu, and all the sand immediately dispersed back into particles. The crowd was left stunned and speechless at the display of sheer power each combatant had given. Naruto too was shocked. He had realized Gaara had been working on something for the past month, but he never would have suspected something for this caliber. With a gulp, he contemplated he contemplated what other attacks his friend might be withholding from him perpetrating for their fight. With another gulp, he realized that moment had in fact just arrived as Lee was walked around by his sensei with a breath to calm himself and a moment to plaster a smile across his features. He jumped out of the box and joined Gaara on the arena floor. He looked across at his oldest friend and thought back to all the times all the times they sparred in the past. Something told him this would be quite on the same level. As they both eyed each other up, the tension in the stadium was palpable. Many preconceived notions about how the student exam finals had been completely and irreparably destroyed. The odds were swinging in both directions with no clear favorite. Although after the last fight, there were a few more options for Gaara. They were given a brief 5 minutes interlude for Gaara to regain his lost chakra, but Shukaku was already taking care of that. Both boys smirked as they looked out at one another. Even they didn't know how this fight would turn out. They had been fighting one another since they were 8 years old. When one got the upper hand, the other would just improvise and turn the tables. Naruto produces a set of lengthened kunai from his sleeves, infusing each blade with a fair amount of wind chakra. One was held in front of him in a guard position, while the other was behind him, held in a reverse grip for speed. He considered bringing out his favorite technique, but again, he didn't want to use it in front of all these people. There would be far too many questions later on. He opted for a few oldies that might catch Gaara off guard. Nobody knew Tsubaku no Gaara like Naruto. That's why he knew Lee almost had the right idea. Rushing Gaara was a good ploy. Getting in close was where he was weakest. The problem lay in knowing if you were fighting Gaara at all. Naruto was dropping into a very low crouch that would aid him getting that little extra burst of speed. When the first feather fell from the sky, he watched it, completely mesmerized by the way its soft white form lazily drifted back and forth. A goofy smile split his face as his eyes moved back and forth, just watching the feather float into the breeze. It was completely out of his knowledge that there were hundreds more, identical to the ones that so captured his attention, also falling from the sky. All around the stadium, the people who did recognize the genjutsu drifted off to sleep, while the shinobi in the crowd started looking around for the cause of the mass illusion. They were only momentarily distracted by the massive burst of smoke from the Hokage's box before enemy shinobi began appearing out of the sleeping denizens of the crowd. Before anybody could react to the Hokage's danger, everybody found themselves fighting off hordes of enemy ninja, each proudly displaying their allegiances with musical notes on their headbands. Gaara was currently attempting to wake Naruto up from his genjutsu-induced lullaby as the Yuya joined them. Having jumped down from the stands, one burst of chakra later, and Naruto was up, his eyes opened wide from the shock-like nature of being ripped from a genjutsu. He looked around in a semi-daze, confused as to what exactly was going on. However, he saw Konoha fighting in Sound Ninja, and that was all the knowledge he needed. He was about to rush off to help when he noticed the enormous purple box that had erupted in the Hokage's box. Fearing for the old man's safety, he took off at pace, leaping and dodging fast-dueling shinobi. He was running like a dog on all fours, using his claws to dig into the earth and propel himself even faster. Gaara and Taiyo were having trouble keeping up and only managed to do so thanks to Naruto stopping on top of the roof where three Anbu stood watching the fight develop inside the translucent barrier. What's happening? One of the Anbu turned to them. He was wearing a mask that gave him the appearance of a rat. The Hokage is currently engaged in combat with the stallion Orochimaru behind this barrier. We are unable to breach it and must trust that our Hokage can handle the situation. Naruto cursed under his breath. He knew some Funjutsu, but would never declare himself a master. If the Anbu could do nothing, then he stood no hope of helping. We were instructed by the Sand Village to offer our aid in the case of an emergency. The Hanbu looked over the three, his eyes narrowing underneath his mask in suspicion. However, right now they couldn't afford to be picky with their help, and he quickly nodded. Fine, there's nothing you can do here. Go help the other shinobi repel the stun ninja attack from the outside. Naruto nodded back, his face now set in a determined grimace as the three set off in the direction the most noise and smoke was coming from. Naruto looked back in time to see Sarutobi going toe-to-toe with Orochimaru. Come on, old man, I know you can beat him. That was all Naruto had time for as they rounded the corner of the street and entered a war zone. Naruto dodged another punch from an older sound ninja, ducking under the rather sloppy blow as he grabbed the man's sleeves and used his momentum to launch him into a nearby wall. He raced after him before the man had even made contact and pulled him out of the miniature crater. He threw him again, this time with more force towards another approaching shinobi who took the blow full in the chest. Naruto swiftly moved on, finding more freak opponents in the mess that were the streets close to the wall. He swerved in a panic as masonry and rubble suddenly fell from the sky around him, forcing him to weave and duck or be crushed underneath. He turned to see the cause of the potential fatal destruction, to see the biggest snake he had ever seen. The worst part was that its dull, lifeless eyes were staring right back at him as its tongue flicked out of its mouth once. Oh crap! Gaara felt more like he was sweeping a roof free of dust than fighting off deadly attempts on his life. His sand swept through the unsuspecting and ill-prepared hordes of enemy ninja, suffocating and beating them into unconsciousness without any real effort in his part. Kunai and Shuriken flew in every direction, always being intercepted by his automatic defense before it could come close to causing him harm. His difficulty was discerning friend from foe, something it was difficult to fine-tune his control to just the sound shinobi when everybody was so densely packed. He had to consciously control his chocolate-laced sand so it would only attack his enemies. Right now, he was calmly walking through the brawling masses, creating his own eye of the hurricane in a few feet around him in every direction. Nobody could even get close. Inside the little bubble of protection were a few children between the ages of 6 and 9. They were kids who hadn't had time to be evacuated, and currently Gaara's sand was protecting them like they were the Jinchurikis themselves. He was walking them through the battle in the direction of the closest concentration of Konoha shinobi who could lead them to the safety of the bunkers. He had started with one kid who had seen how he was protected, and before he knew it, there were almost 15 of them, all huddled around his body in fear. Tayuya was having the most fun of the three, dancing through the battle like a married Pied Piper. Her fingers raced across her flute like they were possessed, weaving more and more intricate genjutsus that served to confuse, disorient, and generally slow down the enemy. Currently, she had a group of sound nin fighting amongst one another, half of them thinking the other were the enemy. Anybody that came across her quickly believed that their flesh was melting right off their body, or that the ground itself was swallowing them alive. Powerful shinobi would come into her vision, only to leave it as cowering balls of tears that were easy pickings for the Konoha shinobi. Like the Pied Piper, she had managed to assemble a group of the Konoha Genin, namely Shino, Lee, and Tenten. They managed to deal with anybody intelligent or strong enough to break out of her genjutsus quickly enough. They worked well as a cohesive unit, dealing with stragglers that Tayuya left behind while protecting the girl herself. Tayuya had previously been annoyed with Lee for her rather humiliating defeat at his hands, that quickly bled away when the boy managed to save her from a very large sound ninja who had rushed her blind spot with a kunai pointed for the kill. Lee had jumped in and managed to swiftly take out the man, all as Tayuya watched on, unable to do anything while her hands, or more specifically her fingers, were busy. Naruto cringed back into himself as he looked around his dark, fleshy prison. He shuddered at the feel of the slimy substance that coated everything, and did everything in his power to not allow it to get into his mouth. It wasn't working. He struggled about as he thought about just how the hell he had managed to get eaten by a snake the size of a building. This is not how I'm going to die. I am not going to I'm not going to be some snake's lunch. He slashed about with the wind chakra infused kunai, only for the rubbery walls to wobble when he struck them. He couldn't get enough leverage behind the blows to do any real damage, and when he did, all he got for his troubles was some blood sprayed in his face. It was hot and sticky, and made the blonde want to throw up. But he persevered. It still had no effect, and he could feel himself get drawn even further into the fleshy tunnel. Right now, he was just glad that snakes ate their meals whole. Right, that's it. Multi-shadow clone. Blah! Even as the jutsu took effect, more of the gunk managed to get into his mouth. From the outside, the shinobi battling the vast snake only saw it pause for a moment before its body began to writhe uncomfortably. One part of its long scaly body expanded suddenly, giving way to hundreds upon hundreds of Naruto clones as its body exploded from the sheer number of them. Snake blood and guts rained down on the battlefield, covering Konoha and Sound Shinobi indiscriminately. The hundreds of Naruto clones poofed out of existence as the original was finally allowed to fall over on his hands and knees as he voided the contents of his stomach in a violent manner. Every fighting shinobi felt it as the general retreat was called, while Orochimaru was seen fleeing the site of his battle. Now a veritable forest atop the roof, the Sound Shinobi all retreated as one, still being cut down or captured by the Leaf Nin as they attempted their hasty escape. Naruto didn't bother to run after them, leaving it up to the Konoha ninja, which he realized had been rather severely reduced in number. Instead, he began making his way back through the battlefields looking for any signs of his teammates. He spotted Tayuya first, her vibrant red hair easy to pick out from the surrounding masses. She quickly helped him locate Gaara, still managing to have a few wayward children cling to him that felt safer with the Sandman than in the shelters. Naruto held back his laugh for their sake, but he would definitely note that down for later. They had to make jokes. What they had seen was gruesome, and if this was how they coped with it, then all the better. The shinobi lifted the street from Otagakure and Konohagakure alike. The Shinigami held no preferences or reserves. They searched through the damaged streets some more, helping to find injured or stranded ninja and civilians. Naruto still couldn't believe the paths of destruction the massive snakes had carved through the village. Entire lines of houses and shops were flattened, reduced to barely rubble and dust. But the walls didn't look that much better, gaping holes littered the once mighty and impenetrable wall, and in some areas it was still crumbling. Hyugas picked through the rubbles, using their Kekkei to locate anybody still alive or trapped in wrecked homes or storefronts. While in the heat of battle, Naruto had barely noticed all the destruction, but now that it was all over, there was nothing else to look at. It was a relief for everybody when night finally came. After many showers, Naruto finally crawled into bed. The Inuzaka compound managed to come out of the ordeal fairly unscathed thanks to its out-of-the-way location. He wrapped his arm around Tayuya's waist more tightly than usual, unintentionally using her as a comfort. He felt her slightly shiver. Despite the tough facade she put up, he knew she had seen more than her fair share of bloodshed and death today. Despite his or her careers, seeing somebody die in front of you, enemy or friend alike, never got any easier. Before he finally allowed himself the embrace of sleep, he let out one last fleeting thought for the friends he had made in his brief stay in the village. He hoped they were okay, but right now it was most important that the girl he was clutching was still there. He didn't know what he would do if Tayuya were ever hurt, or worse, killed. End of chapter 21.